The first sound is not a slogan. It's a dull, practiced rhythm. Baton against riot shield, tap, tap, measuring the street like a metronome. West Berlin, Charlottenburg. Neon spills across wet pavement. A crowd surges toward the doors of the Deutsche Oper, where the Shah of Iran is being welcomed like an ally, like a king, like the kind of guest you don't question in public. Somewhere inside the noise, a student who has never been to a protest before tries to keep his footing. He isn't carrying a weapon. He isn't even carrying a plan. He is carrying an assumption, one most democracies quietly depend on, that the state, even when angry, will not cross certain lines. And then the line is crossed. A shot. A sudden scatter into side streets. People shouting for a medic, for a doctor, for someone older and steadier. A police officer's silhouette turning away from the chaos, as if the body on the ground is just another piece of debris to be stepped around. Benno Ohnesorg dies that night, and West Germany learns a lesson it will repeat for the next 3 decades. A political death doesn't stay in the moment. It travels, it recruits, it hardens into myth. Here's the question the headlines never ask because it's too uncomfortable for everyone involved. What if this wasn't the beginning of terror? What if it was the proof that terror could be made to feel inevitable? A few months earlier, the country was already arguing with its own reflection. Kurt Georg Kiesinger sits at the top of the government, and for a certain generation, that fact alone is a diagnosis. Former Nazi Party membership isn't a rumor, it's a file, it's an address. It's the kind of history that can't be burned away with new suits and better vocabulary. West Germany is rebuilding fast, growing rich, trying to look forward. But in university halls and cramped apartments, young Germans look at the men in power and see the past wearing a fresh tie. In 1968, a woman walks up to the chancellor at a party conference in Berlin, raises her hand, and slaps him in front of cameras, hard enough that the sound becomes part of the news cycle. "Nazi!" she shouts. The word isn't analysis, it's a verdict. There's a reason moments like that go viral before viral is even a concept. They simplify, they compress. They make politics feel like a single gesture can set things right. But history doesn't reset from a slap. It resets from pressure applied over years until something fractures. The pressure is everywhere. The Vietnam War on television, student movements across the world, anti-colonial revolutions turned into posters and slogans. In West Germany, the extra-parliamentary opposition, students, leftists, activists, forms as a kind of shadow politics, an argument conducted outside the official system. They don't just want policy changes, they want moral purification. They want the state to admit what it was, and to stop acting like it can simply become something else through paperwork. And for a while, it is still politics, marches, teach-ins, debates so long the ashtrays overflow. The movement has factions, disagreements, fragile friendships. Some believe you can pressure the system until it reforms. Others believe the system is built to absorb pressure, like a sponge, and stay the same. Then comes April 1968. Rudi Dutschke, one of the most visible student leaders, is shot by a far-right extremist. He survives, but the signal is clear. Violence isn't a theoretical risk anymore. It's part of the conversation. You can almost hear the room shift. When people talk about radicalization, they often talk about ideology. That's convenient. Ideology is tidy. Ideology fits in books. Radicalization is often less tidy. It's grief. It's humiliation. It's the feeling of being laughed at by institutions that can injure you and then deny they did. It's the moment you watch someone bleed, figuratively or literally, and realize your rules don't apply to everyone equally. Inside this pressure cooker, a small group begins to treat violence not as a threat, but as a tool. Andreas Baader is not an academic. He's not a patient organizer. He's combustible, more attitude than theory. Gudrun Ensslin is sharper, more disciplined, a believer with a moral edge that can cut in any direction. Together, they become something dangerous, a couple who don't just share politics, but share escalation. In April 1968, department stores in Frankfurt are set on fire. It's meant as protest against a society that consumes while others burn. Vietnam, imperialism, the whole catalog of global guilt. No one dies in the arson attacks, but the message is not, listen to us. The message is, we can touch your comfort. The state responds the way states respond. Investigations, trials, prison sentences. The system tries to turn a political act into a criminal case because that's what the system knows how to do. Baader ends up in custody. For most movements, that is where the story would narrow. A name fades, a group regroups, someone else becomes the face. For this story, prison becomes a door. A journalist steps into frame. Ulrike Meinhof has credibility, a public voice, the kind of intellectual reputation that gives a movement legitimacy. She writes, argues, critiques, and she is also quietly a hinge, someone who can swing between above-ground politics and underground action. What matters here is not whether Meinhof was meant to go underground. What matters is that the boundary between words and action has started to blur. And once that boundary blurs, people begin to treat violence like a form of speech, more honest, more urgent, more real than debate. May 14th, 1970. Baader is allowed out under supervision to consult research materials at the Central Institute for Social Issues in West Berlin. It sounds harmless. It sounds bureaucratic. A man in custody reading documents, an image designed to prove the state is civilized. Then the door opens and the trap snaps shut. Gunfire, confusion, a staff member injured, a window, literal, physical, becomes a root. Baader runs. The escort is overwhelmed. The paperwork of democracy can't keep up with the speed of a getaway car. And Meinhof, who could have stayed on the safe side of the line, runs with them. There is a moment, right here, when the story stops being about protest and becomes about identity. Because once you flee with a wanted man, you can't go back to being a critic of the system. You become the system's enemy, and the system, with all its files and uniforms and laws, knows exactly how to treat enemies. Less than a month later, the rhetoric hardens into a founding myth. In underground publications, declarations appear, calls to build a Red Army, to begin armed struggle, to treat West Germany not as a flawed democracy, but as a fascist continuation wearing democratic skin. That framing matters. If you convince yourself you live under fascism, then almost any violence becomes resistance. If you convince yourself your opponents are Nazis, then you don't negotiate with them. You destroy them. The group goes looking for training, and the Cold War obliges. They move through sympathetic networks across borders, slipping along the edges where law enforcement jurisdictions blur. They end up in the Middle East, in camps affiliated with Palestinian organizations, learning to handle weapons, learning discipline, learning the practical craft of turning conviction into capability. There's a small human detail that's easy to miss in the geopolitics. How quickly people can adapt to a new normal. One week you're arguing in a smoky apartment about Marx and imperialism. The next, you're learning how to strip a rifle in the desert, your fingers smelling of oil and metal, your mind rehearsing the idea that one day you might point that weapon at a police officer back home. And when they return to West Germany, they don't return as a protest movement. They return as a clandestine organization. False identities, cash payments, stolen cars with swapped plates, apartments rented through intermediaries. The kind of living that makes every doorbell sound like a siren, every knock a test. You begin to measure friendships not by warmth, but by usefulness. You begin to treat ordinary life as camouflage. This is where the Red Army faction, RAF as it will be called, becomes something more than a handful of militants. It becomes a system, a cell structure, compartmentalization. People using pseudonyms not as affectation, but as armor, a leadership circle that coordinates while smaller groups execute. A support environment of sympathizers, some true believers, some conflicted, some simply unable to say no to the urgency of helping comrades. The dirty secret of underground violence is that it often depends on above-ground normality. Someone needs to rent the car. Someone needs to print the pamphlets. Someone needs to open the door without asking too many questions. And here's another deferred question, because it's one of the most important ones in the RAF story. At what point does solidarity become logistics for murder? In 1971, the RAF publishes a strategic statement. Urban guerrilla warfare. The idea is not random chaos. The idea is sustained pressure, small attacks that demonstrate the state's vulnerability, provoke repression, and, in the RAF's dream, trigger broader revolutionary awakening. It's a theory built for places where the state is brittle. West Germany is not brittle. West Germany is bureaucratic, wealthy, and increasingly determined. It has courts and police and intelligence services that can learn. It has a public that, even when sympathetic to criticism of the past, does not want to live in fear of bombs and bullets. So the RAF does what many militant groups do when reality refuses to match theory. They escalate. Bank robberies become expropriations. Violence becomes counter-violence. Every moral boundary becomes a bourgeois illusion. Every death becomes either collateral or the fault of the system. Meanwhile, the state begins to map them. In an office somewhere, fluorescent light, stale coffee, cigarette smoke trapped in curtains. There's a wall map with red pins, each pin a robbery, each pin a sighting, each pin a rumor that someone's cousin's friend saw someone who looked like someone else. One pin becomes two become 10. At first the pins are scattered, then a pattern starts to emerge, a geography of fear, a network of hideouts and routes and support nodes. The map becomes a kind of second battlefield, paper and ink fighting shadows. A young detective, new enough to still flinch at the word shootout, old enough to know he could be the one bleeding, leans in and traces the pins with a fingertip. He doesn't say it out loud, but he's thinking the same thing every government thinks when confronted with a small group that refuses to stop. If we miss once, they will teach others how to do it. And on the other side, in an apartment with curtains always drawn, a young RAF recruit, new enough to romanticize, old enough to understand the risk, stares at a cheap mirror and practices a fake name, a fake signature, a fake life. He's thinking the same thing every militant thinks when their own movement starts to harden. If we hesitate once, we will become ordinary again. This is the point where the story stops being a clash of ideas and becomes a clash of clocks. Because by early 1972, both sides are running out of time. The RAF needs a dramatic strike, something that proves relevance, something that forces the public to look, something that cannot be ignored or dismissed as petty crime. The state needs arrests, fast enough to prevent a wave, and public enough to reassure a society already tense from years of upheaval. And somewhere in that narrowing corridor, a plan forms, not a manifesto, not a debate. A coordinated offensive, the kind of action that will leave a mark not just on targets, but on the rules of West German life itself. The last normal week is ending. In the map room, someone pushes in another red pin. In the safe house, someone checks a bag twice, then a third time, because the hands can't stay still when history is about to accelerate. And the question hangs in the air, sharp, unavoidable. When the bombs go off, will West Germany break? Or will it change into something it never wanted to be? The offensive doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrives like paperwork, quiet, inevitable, stacking up on desks in police stations and intelligence offices until the folders start to bend. A few names recur too often. A few safe houses change hands too quickly. A few bank robberies feel less like desperation and more like routine. And then, in May 1972, the rhythm breaks. Explosions, staggered across cities, timed and chosen to announce something larger than crime, a campaign. Targets connected to the state, to authority, to the American presence in West Germany. Symbols meant to transmit a single message. We can reach you. For the people who have spent years arguing in lecture halls, this is the RAF trying to translate theory into fact. For the people who have to walk into the damaged buildings afterward, police, medics, clerks, soldiers, it is something simpler, a new kind of fear, engineered, repeatable. In the map room, the red pins are no longer scattered. They begin to cluster. A senior officer stands with a pencil over a wall chart and realizes the quiet horror of modern terrorism. It doesn't need to be large to feel everywhere. It needs only to be unpredictable enough to make ordinary life feel like a gamble. The state answers with the oldest tool it has, saturation, roadblocks, checkpoints. Patrols so frequent they become part of the landscape, like streetlights. West Germany mobilizes law enforcement at a scale meant to send a countermessage. You are not invisible. The country is getting smaller around you. And this is where the RAF's romance, its self-image as elusive urban guerrillas, meets a reality it can't rewrite. Because clandestine life is not heroic. It is tiring. It is always looking over your shoulder. It is never using your own name. It is memorizing exits the way other people memorize birthdays. It is lying so often you forget which details are true. And tired people make mistakes. In early summer, the net tightens. A vehicle is spotted. A face matches a photograph. A routine stop becomes a standoff. A few minutes turn into a gunfight. And when it ends, one of the RAF's most notorious figures is not a myth on a pamphlet. He's bleeding, disarmed, and in handcuffs. Another member surrenders in a moment so stripped of ideology it becomes almost embarrassing. Barely dressed, frightened, alive. A small detail, the kind propaganda can't polish. That's what counterterrorism often does to revolutionary theater. It forces the actors back into the physical world, where bullets do not care about slogans. Within weeks, the first generation, the leadership circle that once coordinated the cells and fed the narrative, is largely in custody. If this were a conventional story, this would be the ending. But a movement like the RAF is built to survive decapitation. Not because it is strong in numbers, its numbers were always small, but because it is strong in a certain kind of belief. The belief that being hunted proves you are important. So, the war moves into a new arena. Not the street, the cell. Prison is supposed to be containment. A way to turn violence back into a court case. A way to replace adrenaline with procedure. But the RAF understands something the state would rather not admit. Prison can be turned into a stage. The prison regime is harsh, high security, isolation, constant scrutiny, designed to prevent communication, to stop coordination, to keep the leadership from continuing to run the organization. But isolation has a psychological consequence the authorities can't fully control. It makes every rumor feel like evidence, every restriction feel like torture, every ordinary hardship feel like a deliberate plot. Lawyers become couriers in a world where every sentence can be weaponized. Paper becomes contraband. A visit becomes a battle. And in the space between security and rights, the RAF finds oxygen. They demand recognition not as criminals, but as political prisoners, combatants. They speak in the language of war because the language of war justifies refusal. It justifies escalation. It justifies the idea that compromise is betrayal. Outside the prison walls, supporters argue about what they're seeing. Some on the left recoil. They see the bombings, the injuries, the dead. And they feel the movement fracture under their feet. They still hate the old Nazi shadows in government, still despise hypocrisy, still oppose imperialism. But they don't want to become accomplices to a campaign that treats human beings as collateral. Others lean in, not necessarily because they love violence, but because they hate the state more, and because suffering, real or alleged, creates a moral shortcut. If the prison is brutal, then the prisoners must be right. This is the RAF's second life, not in safe houses, but in argument. And then comes the hunger strikes. In an analyst's cold framing, hunger strikes are leverage, an attempt to force the state into a choice it doesn't want, ease conditions and look weak, or maintain conditions and risk death, and then deal with the backlash. In human terms, it is simpler and darker, bodies turned into political documents. When Holger Mans dies in custody in 1974 after a hunger strike, it becomes a pivot point. His death is not just mourned, it is used by sympathizers as proof of state cruelty, by opponents as proof of RAF fanaticism. A funeral draws thousands. The RAF does not need to be free to be present. It needs only to remain symbolic. And symbolism is contagious. Inside offices, officials read reports with the same exhausted frustration. We arrested them. Why is the country still vibrating? Inside apartments, younger radicals read the same headlines and feel something else. They're willing to die. What does that say about us? That is the trap. Once martyrdom enters the story becomes harder to end. Because you are no longer fighting a group. You are fighting an idea about a group. And ideas don't sit still in prison. By the mid-1970s, the RAF's second generation is in motion, more careful, more compartmentalized, less attached to the personalities of 1970 and more attached to the mission of continuity. They recruit through networks, filter newcomers, tighten discipline. They work in small commandos. They rely on above-ground contacts for logistics, safe apartments, vehicles, money, documents. The state understands the structure now, but understanding is not the same as catching it. A cell system is designed so that one arrest does not collapse the whole. No one holds the full map. No one can betray what they don't know. Meanwhile, the prison leadership, still treated as the core, remains a gravitational center. The second generation's logic becomes brutally straightforward. If the founders can't be freed, then the state must be punished until it yields. And so, the game becomes hostage politics. In 1975, militants take hostages and demand prisoner releases. The government makes partial concessions and immediately learns the lesson that will haunt it afterward. Exchanges can feel like saving lives in the moment, but they can also teach an organization that abduction works. Weeks later, the message hardens on both sides. Then comes Stockholm, April 1975. The West German embassy is seized, demands are issued again. And this time, the situation spirals. Hostages killed, an accidental explosion. A chaotic end that leaves the government with a grim conviction that negotiation is not a policy, it's a stimulus. The refusal to trade the imprisoned leaders becomes a doctrine. And doctrines, like all doctrines, have a cost. By now, the RAF is no longer only a domestic problem. Training, contacts, ideology, everything sits under the wider umbrella of the Cold War, where borders are political instruments and intelligence services have their own reasons to look the other way. The RAF does not need a superpower to love it. It needs a superpower to find it useful. Useful enough to survive, and survival is enough to keep killing. In 1976, Ulrike Meinhof is found dead in her cell. Authorities rule it a suicide. Conspiracy theories bloom anyway, because conspiracy is what happens when trust is gone, and the prison walls are opaque. Her death works like a match dropped into dry grass. To the RAF's enemies, it is the end of a poisonous chapter. To the RAF's sympathizers, it is the proof that the state destroys its opponents even when it claims to be humane. To the second generation, it is a commandment. Continue. By 1977, West Germany is a country with two clocks ticking at once. One is the clock of law, courts, sentences, procedures, the deliberate pace of a democracy trying to remain itself. The other is the clock of coercion, deadlines, ultimatums, threats delivered with the confidence that fear moves faster than legislation. In the map room, the red pins don't just mark crimes anymore, they mark a strategy. Pressure points aimed at the government's nerve endings. In government offices, ministers sleep in short bursts and drink coffee that never tastes warm. In the prison at Stammheim, the lights feel like they never fully dim. Not because someone forgot the switch, but because no one trusts darkness. And the deferred question you've been carrying since part 1 sharpens into something more specific, more dangerous. If the state refuses to bargain, how far will the RAF go to force its hand? Because the next phase won't be bombings meant to shock. It will be decisions meant to break. And when the breaking starts, it won't only be buildings. It will be the rules West Germany has been trying, desperately, to live by. By autumn 1977, West Germany feels like a room where everyone speaks softly, because raising your voice might trigger something. The RAF's second generation stops chasing symbolism and starts chasing leverage. A prominent industrialist, Hans Martin Schleyer, is abducted. The demand is blunt: free the prisoners. The government answers with a sentence that sounds simple and costs a nation's sleep. No deals. For weeks, the country runs on two channels at once. On one, television anchors read statements with steady faces. On the other, police radios crackle through the night. Checkpoints, searches, false leads, doors opened at gunpoint, then closed again. In offices, the wall maps are so crowded with pins they begin to look less like investigations and more like scars. Then the pressure jumps borders. A Lufthansa plane, Flight 181, is hijacked by militants aligned with the same cause. The message is the same, delivered in a new arena. Release them or watch the crisis widen. The government holds. A German special unit storms the aircraft in Mogadishu and rescues the hostages. The country exhales once, like it's been allowed a single breath. And then the story turns darker, not with an explosion, but with silence. Within hours, the imprisoned RAF leaders are found dead in Stammheim. Authorities call it suicide. Supporters call it murder. The truth, for most people watching from outside, becomes less important than the effect. A final fog of mistrust poured over an already poisoned well. Schleyer is killed soon after. This is the moment the RAF loses something it can't rob from a bank or print in a communique: the ability to pretend it is building a better world. Even many on the left, people who once marched against old Nazis and foreign wars, now see only a machine that trades lives for relevance. The RAF continues for years, mutating into new generations, shrinking, hardening, fading. In 1998, it dissolves on paper. But paper doesn't erase memory. Germany keeps the files. The scars remain in law, in policing, in the quiet reflex to look twice at an unattended bag. On the map wall, someone eventually pulls the pins out. The board looks clean, but the holes are still there.